Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. In this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, we hear from Susan Colbourn, Associate Director of the Triangle Institute for Security Studies at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University, and author of the newly released book, Euromissiles, the Nuclear Weapons That Nearly Destroyed NATO. Colbourn walks us through the controversies that surrounded the SS-20, the Pershing II, as well as the Ground-Launched Cruise Missile, or GLICM, in the late 1970s and 1980s. She details the degree to which these controversies revealed rifts within the domestic political interests of NATO partners, as well as concerns over the fragility of the U.S. extended nuclear deterrence umbrella. This is a fascinating history of a period that is often forgotten because it was resolved not so much through a conciliation of the interests as through the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, which rendered the argument moot. As Colbourn argues, many of these interests remain today and may highlight concerns as we take a look at Europe's newly muscular emerging defense policy in light of Russian aggression in Ukraine. Let's listen in.
With my time today, I want to talk about my book, Euromissiles, the Nuclear Weapons That Nearly Destroyed NATO, which came out with Cornell University Press earlier this month. A fun aside about the subtitle: when, as many of you know, if you've written a book, you propose a title to the marketing team at the press, and the marketing team usually comes back and says, hate that, hate that, hate that, let's rework it from the bottom up. So I had some really anodyne title because enough friends of mine had published with Cornell that they said, don't spend any time, you'll have to change it. So just go with something that explains the book broadly, and it'll get changed. So it was called Euromissiles, the Transatlantic History. I told you, pretty anodyne. It was really specific. Marketing came back and said, it needs more drama. And so, which fine. But their suggestion, one of them, in the most beautiful and incorrect interpretations, was it should be Euromissiles, NATO's nuclear nightmare. And I had to write back and say, I think that would have been nuclear war. So we ended up instead with, I think, a much better title that hopefully hints at the various ways that these nuclear weapons I'm going to talk about threaten the alliance, not only with the possible destruction of nuclear war, but also the more gradual erosion of the transatlantic bargain. So the book itself is a transatlantic history of the so-called Euromissiles, and those are the Theater Nuclear Forces, TNF, or Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF, that dominated much of the 1970s and 1980s. I promise I'm going to try to keep the acronyms to a limited use. There's a lot of acronyms in the NATO world, but I will try and spell them out where I can. And so in a somewhat unusual thing for a book, a history book, I guess my central cast of characters are not really people, but necessarily three types of missiles. So you have on one side the Soviet Union's RSD-10 pioneers, which many of you probably know if you've heard of them by their NATO reporting name, the SS-20 Sabre. Then you have American missiles, the BGM-109G Griffin ground-launched cruise missiles, almost always called GLICMs, and U.S. Pershing II ballistic missiles. And so the history that I tell in this book started from a basic premise, answering a fairly straightforward, but it turned out to be quite complicated question: why did the Euromissiles matter? With my time today, I want to talk briefly a little bit about how I came to this project and the process of researching this book, and then walk through some of the major episodes and flag a few of the key takeaways and arguments I make in the book. So I think we are, in many ways, at an inflection point in thinking historically about the late Cold War. I think it's a shift that I see rooted in two major simultaneous phenomena. One is about growing access to archival material from the 1970s and particularly from the 1980s. And the other is a generational shift. Sufficient time has passed that a generation of scholars finishing PhDs and writing first books who are thinking about this period do not have firsthand memories of the Cold War, even of its end. Many of us, myself included, were young kids when the Berlin Wall came down. A critical element of this project for me was to write an accessible account of an immensely complex issue using recently released and newly available archival material. In other words, I wanted to write a book that could help explain the stakes of the Euromissiles, primarily to a generation of readers who might not be immediately familiar with the dynamics and arguments at play, the sort of language that underpinned so much of the Cold War, the assumptions that lurked in that system, and the nuclear arms race between the two superpowers and their respective alliances. So I want to say first a few words about how I approached that task. I think typically when we think about the Euromissiles, we tend to think of moments maybe like this one. Right here you have Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, two men who probably need no introduction to this crowd, signing the INF Treaty. This is the December 1987 agreement that did away with the Euromissiles. But the story I tell in the book is not just a story about this dramatic change in superpower relations. It is also about scenes like this one that were just as common. Here, hundreds of thousands assembled in the West German capital of Bonn to oppose NATO's plans to deploy the Glickums and Pershing IIs in Western Europe. Though, as you can see, opposition was always about more than just the missiles. We have banners here calling for neutrality, an end to NATO membership. Here in the front in the red, right, that Spain, who had recently just joined NATO in 1982, should reject its recent membership in NATO. And so to explain why the Euromissiles mattered, I felt that it was not enough to look at these two phenomena in isolation, but to bring together various strands. So to put widespread social movements alongside nuclear strategy and superpower diplomacy. And so in the book, Euromissiles shifts the frame. Rather than focus on one dimension of the issue, be that relations between the superpowers or public opposition movements, I opted instead to put NATO at the center, to consider the interactions between alliance politics, electoral politics, and superpower politics. And that was a choice that ultimately shaped how I approached the research that I did for this project. The book draws on deep archival work from across the Atlantic Alliance in member states, both large and small, as well as the official holdings of the NATO archives held at the headquarters in Brussels. I conducted research in presidential records and prime ministerial papers, along with Foreign Ministry, Defense Ministry, and intelligence records from Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and the Federal Republic of Germany. I want to give you just one example of what this turned out. Here is a pretty characteristically blunt assessment from the French Foreign Ministry archives that makes clear that, right here, point one, right, that the Federal Republic of Germany is at the center of the debate about whether or not to modernize NATO's theater nuclear forces, these mid-range weapons in Europe. The role and importance of the Federal Republic of Germany, of West Germany, is something that I draw out fairly in fairly extensive detail throughout the book. But the use of a multinational source space was not just about providing different perspectives and assessments within a complex and sometimes frustratingly complex alliance, or about moving beyond treatments focused solely on the biggest allies, though this was something I cared a lot about. It was also driven by the realities of doing contemporary history. On sensitive questions like nuclear issues, there is still plenty of information withheld. Governments are, for all the reasons you predict, and probably a few more, reluctant to share sensitive material about basing, about sharing, about all aspects of the nuclear posture. We can take, for example, the Central Intelligence Agency's recent effort to get the Foreign Relations of the United States volume on US-Soviet relations from 1983 to 1986 recalled over one document that was printed pertaining to everyone's favorite thing, the much-debated NATO exercise Able Archer 83. And even with records dating back 50 years, it is not uncommon to see a lot of pages like this one. But institutional records were not enough to tell the story I wanted to tell, at least not traditional government and alliance institutional records. I looked for ways that I could capture the perspectives and arguments of activists, of protesters, to understand why and how they mobilized against the Euromissiles. I wanted, in particular, to move beyond some of the ideologically inflected charges and polemics that had been levied in the period, where critics were convinced that the so-called peace movement was an omnibus grouping of individuals who represented little more than Soviet stooges or useful idiots. And so there, in many ways, the research that I did differed from working in foreign ministry or intelligence service papers. I looked at photographs and pamphlets. I watched nightly news segments and visited archives dedicated to the preservation of anti-nuclear campaigns and other peace movements. Places that were preserving material like this 1986 pamphlet from the British-based Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which I photographed at the London School of Economics. And so you can see a few of the arguments, which I'll talk about when I get to the meat of the book here, but a little teaser of the arguments that were made against the Euromissiles and broadly against the US nuclear presence, right? Complete erosion of sovereignty in the British case, right? That the United Kingdom was airstrip #1 for the USA. I particularly like the slogan, overarmed, overeager, over here, which has a nice sort of hearkening back to the past and some broader contours of US-British relations. The end result of doing this international research was a book that draws on written material and archival collections from 8 countries and over 24 repositories. It also uses a slew of photographs and popular culture and published media. Now, it can be tempting, if you've seen an international historian talk, to fetishize that kind of work, right? Collecting archives just for the sake of nothing more than saying, I went to 8 countries and more than 24 archives. But doing the work in that way, telling it as an international history, for me, was critical that the sources be able to capture an array of perspectives in order to tell a long history of the Euromissiles in transatlantic perspective. And I wanted, critically, to be sure that the history I told was a history of NATO that was not, at the end of the day, just a history of US foreign policy, or, in maybe a more charitable telling, the Big Four: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and West Germany. So I want to dive in now to some of the arguments that I make in the book. I locate the origins of the Euromissiles issue in broader structural elements of the transatlantic relationship. It was an issue framed by basic parameters and tensions of the post-war transatlantic bargain, chief among them the problems of Allied defense. Since the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty in April of 1949, the Western Allies had struggled and struggled and struggled again to figure out how to provide a sufficient defense. As an intellectual exercise, if you were designing an alliance from scratch in the Cold War world, you probably would not have ever picked one shaped like NATO. You would not want your most powerful actor to be the furthest from the front lines against a land power sharing a continent with most of the countries you are going to promise to protect. This created perennial problems about how to credibly project power and provide sufficient reassurance to the Western European powers, both large and small. Now, what I've said there should not come as a shock to anyone familiar with NATO's history, that extended deterrence, right, the effort to project US power all the way to the dividing line of Europe, to the Fulda Gap, was always fraught in the NATO context with recurring bouts of skepticism and angst. The story of the Euromissiles is no different. The problems of a credible extended deterrent and how to make extended deterrence credible appear time and again, so much so that it was a little bit challenging as a writer to figure out how to talk about the same problems over and over again without putting my reader to sleep. In the book, I follow these debates from the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 through to the end of the Cold War, pushing beyond when Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty in December 1987. For our purposes today, I don't want to give you a full survey of the book, but to dig into a few critical episodes. So in finding the origins, the conventional wisdom holds that the issue began with the Soviet deployment of these weapons, the SS-20s, in the mid-1970s. The SS-20s were a significant upgrade in Soviet capabilities in the European theater from the earlier generation of medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles the Soviet Union had previously deployed. The SS-20s had a little bit more stability. Far fewer of them, at least, had the pesky habit of blowing up on the launch pad because they no longer relied on unstable liquid fuel like the earlier SS-4s and SS-5s. In the conventional telling, it is these weapons, the Soviet SS-20s, that posed a new threat to Western Europe and forced NATO to respond with deployments of its own. NATO's response, famously in this telling, being spurred by a speech that West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt gave at IISS in London in October of 1977, calling into question whether the United States could really defend Europe, raising the specter of what NATO watchers called decoupling, right? That the security of Europe might be separated from that of the United States. And that this culminated in the alliance's 1979 dual-track decision, which I'll discuss further in a moment. That conventional wisdom is wrong. The arrival of the Soviet SS-20s were not a fundamentally new problem. It made an existing problem worse. The Western Allies, particularly the Federal Republic of Germany, had been long concerned about the implications of parity between the United States and the Soviet Union. Right? The prospect that the arsenals, the nuclear arsenals of both superpowers were reaching roughly the same amount. This was made worse by the signing of the first agreement to limit strategic weapons, 1972's SALT I, which we can see Nixon and Brezhnev signing here. The West Germans worried. The West Germans were not alone in worrying, but the West Germans were the most vocal in worrying that parity would ultimately erode the United States' ability to extend its deterrent to Europe, right? That umbrella provided by the US nuclear arsenal would no longer be so credible. But even after the deployment of the SS-20s, the degree to which those new Soviet missiles posed a risk to NATO or to its members was far from clear or agreed upon in the alliance. So West German officials were alarmed and worried about the rise of a new balance in the European theater, what they referred to as the Euro-strategic balance. Right? So the idea here being that there was a balance, the strategic balance between the United States and the Soviet Union, but because SALT I had put a cap on the strategic arsenals and defined the strategic arsenals in such a way that it did not include weapons stationed in Europe, that then this would create a circumstance in which there would be another sub-strategic or Euro-strategic balance in the continent. Both the administrations of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter offered repeated assurances to West German policymakers that these missiles did nothing to change the overall balance of power. They might be modernized, they might have multiple warheads now, but in the end, NATO's strategy was going to hold, the protection was the same. And then the Carter administration changes its tune. And that was the result of another nuclear issue, the crisis over the enhanced radiation warhead, a weapon better known as the neutron bomb. In the summer of 1977, press leaks drew attention to this new tactical weapon that was buried in the budget of one of the US nuclear agencies. And it quickly set off a firestorm and galvanized protesters. It stoked a resurgence of anti-nuclear activism after years spent in the doldrums. And against mounting public opposition with protests like this one here in the Netherlands, a fraction of that opposition, stoked and bankrolled by Warsaw Pact intelligence services, the NATO allies struggled to cobble together a plan to see the deployment through for these new anti-tank systems. That was a painstaking effort to reach an agreement, and it occupied much of the winter and spring of 1977 and 1978. And then, when the allies were on the verge of approving an incredibly complicated package that married a deferral of deployments with deployments across many countries and an arms control offer to the Soviet Union, Jimmy Carter pulled the plug. Carter's decision was roundly criticized. Carter's choice to walk away from that painstakingly forged agreement was taken as evidence of moralistic temporizing, of a lack of leadership. In the press, aides of Helmut Schmidt and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, Schmidt's foreign minister and coalition partner, mocked the president. They derided him as a religious dreamer and convinced that the Carter administration was, in the words of one aide, Klaus Kinkel, a leaderless hen coop. You might recognize some of these. These are some pervasive stereotypes about what the Carter administration and its foreign policy were like. But Carter refused to let members of his administration push back on these charges. He concluded that the cost would be too high if it caused any more difficulty in the administration's dealings with Helmut Schmidt's Federal Republic. And here, I should say, for those of you not familiar, this is one of the most fascinating interpersonal relationships in politics. These men hated one another. There was no love lost between Jimmy Carter and Helmut Schmidt. Carter aides described Schmidt as a know-it-all who was convinced he would be a better president if only he were eligible for the post. The political fallout of Carter's decision to cancel the neutron bomb and scrap this whole scheme made it virtually impossible for the administration to continue its earlier line of argumentation that the SS-20s didn't really matter, didn't really change the security situation in Europe. And so, in the wake of the neutron bomb cancellation, the end of this package, the Carter administration comes around on the need to deploy new missiles to Western Europe to help shore up West German confidence in NATO's strategy of flexible response and in extended deterrence. It took another 18 months to reach an agreement. What resulted in December 1979 was a complicated agreement with two main components. And as a result, it became known by the incredibly creative name, the dual-track decision. Component one, component two. The first track was to deploy new ground-based missiles to Western Europe. So the Griffins and Pershing IIs that I mentioned at the outset. In shaping this deployment, however, it was a little bit more complicated. So the West Germans were insistent that they could not be alone in shouldering the burden of accepting new missiles. To avoid what West German policymakers very unfortunately called singularization, the decision called for burden sharing across allies. So a slate of missiles would go to the United Kingdom, but that wasn't seen as enough by West German policymakers. The British, after all, had at least notionally an independent nuclear program of their own. And so the West Germans wanted a non-nuclear power on the continent to also accept some of the missiles. And so as part of this 18 months of wrangling, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands round out the slate of basing countries. Though even in December 1979, when they meet to take this decision, it's pretty clear the Belgians and the Dutch are maybe not going to go along with it, at least not on the timeline that the West Germans want. So that's track one. You're going to deploy. The second track of the dual track decision was to undertake arms control negotiations in parallel with the Soviet Union on the same systems. So to try and negotiate reductions in the Soviet arsenal, particularly those SS-20s that we saw in the forest just a moment ago, and in the hopes that either you're going to secure reductions before you need to deploy. The deployment track was scheduled for 1983, this weird long 4-year lag. Or worst case scenario, that finally when you start deploying in 1983, you're going to have enough leverage to really get reductions at the negotiating table. It was a decision that was a classic product of alliance wrangling. It expressed a degree of consensus, but virtually no one around this table agreed on the underlying logic or relationship between the deployment track and the arms control track. Some saw deployments as necessary in order to shore up the strategy of escalation, right, to have a range of options envisioned in flexible response, right? They used all these pretty hokey metaphors to describe how escalation would work. In flexible response, it was a seamless robe of deterrence, it was links in a chain, it was rungs in a ladder, but the idea being that you would have a series of options to go up and go down. I want to be clear that just like they didn't agree about what the dual track decision meant, they also did not agree about what flexible response meant. So there's a lot of ambiguity in the story here. That there's a lot of ambiguity in the definition of flexible response. That they don't agree, allies do not all agree on what flexible response will look like as a strategy, but they broadly see it as one operating with this idea of escalation, the ladder, the chain, pick your hokey metaphor. So if some saw the deployments as necessary to shore up this strategy of flexible response, or what they believed to be the strategy of flexible response, others believed the deployments would be a critical bargaining chip to secure reductions in the Soviet arsenal. Now, instead of resolving which of these schools was the underlying logic in the dual track decision, the Allies just sidestepped the question and moved on. They agreed that they agreed enough to get a decision and that the ambiguity would help keep some consensus. And so both interpretations coexisted, however, uncomfortably. Now, if the dual track decision was intended as reassurance from the United States to its allies, primarily in Western Europe, about the protection of the US nuclear arsenal, it landed in a very different political climate. It created an immense amount of anxiety. The dual track decision came at a particularly terrible period in US-Soviet relations in December of 1979. Just 2 weeks after the alliance met around that table that I just showed you to agree to the final decision, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Superpower relations after that were virtually in a free fall, with widespread and growing concern that the Cold War had returned to Europe after a number of years of relative peace and security. You have mounting fears of nuclear annihilation, which came to define much of the early 1980s. So this is a cover from the major Canadian news weekly Maclean's. I think the basic argument is pretty clear from the giant mushroom cloud. But if we think about the popular culture of the day, it is everywhere. There are mushroom clouds going off all the time. You have films like War Games, where Matthew Broderick's character accidentally finds himself, he thinks he's playing a video game, and he is actually playing a real war game, except maybe it's just going to be war. You have Threads. You have The Day After, where NATO and the Warsaw Pact are going to trade nuclear strikes, and there goes the center of Kansas in some graphics that haven't aged very well for those of you who haven't seen it. You have 99 Red Balloons in English and in German, a chart topper where nuclear war happens by accident because of 99 red balloons. Those fears were amplified by a new president. Ronald Reagan was seen by many as an anti-Soviet hawk, willing to talk tough and spend reams of money to defeat the Soviet Union. And much of Reagan's early rhetoric added fuel to the fire, leaving many concerned at home and across Western Europe, across the alliance, that the Cold War might turn hot. I want to give you a few examples from the archives. Here is young Elizabeth, writing to President Reagan in 1982 that she wants to grow up and be free. Please, 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 will you stop nuclear weapons? I want to have fun, but with nuclear war, I wouldn't have fun. I think Elizabeth has a pretty compelling message, one we can all get behind, and really resonated with folks much older than our 8-year-old Elizabeth here. Or you have the message of British socialists who saw a generation of conservative politicians all too enamored with the power of nuclear weapons. So I hope that you can read some of the small print, because it's a searing indictment both of conservative economic policy, but also of the sort of nuclear age and an affection for nuclear weapons in the 1980s. Right, so the tagline here, she promised to follow him to the end of the earth. He promised to organize it. But if you can see here in the very bottom, it's an IMF picture, Milton Friedman in association with Pentagon Productions. So there's a lot of loaded language here about the intersections between conservative economic policies gaining ground in the 1980s, most commonly associated with Reagan and Thatcher, and then, of course, concerns about nuclear war. I have been told, and maybe Will can tell us later, that apparently Reagan had a copy of this on the farm. Steve Hayward told me that.
Oh, perhaps.
But
he got a kick out of this kind of stuff. So.
Yeah. So you have messages like this incredibly subtle one from the British socialists. It was a message that traveled. So I showed you this picture before, and you probably focused on maybe some languages you don't really feel comfortable reading. But I want to point out here. Here's that same poster I just showed you, printed out on a cardboard sheet, paraded in Bonn. This is from October of 1981. Protests rocked Western Europe and North America. These Dutch activists cruised the canals of Rotterdam in what they styled a cruise against cruise. Widespread popular opposition to nuclear weapons, like these protests, provided ample opportunities and openings for the Soviet Union and its allies to try and stop the deployments called for in the dual-track decision. The Soviet Union and its allies across the Warsaw Pact amplified homegrown dissent. They provided funds and carefully calibrated messaging to maximize discontent. But I want to be crystal clear. The critics who opposed the Euromissiles, who took to the streets to oppose NATO's deployments, came from diverse backgrounds and political traditions. They opposed the missiles on a variety of grounds in what was truly a big tent. Some came from an understandable fear of nuclear war. Others came because they rejected the underlying logic of the ongoing Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. Some came because they had religious objections to the morality of nuclear deterrence. Feminists attacked the arms race as a masculine endeavor. One need look no further than the language of nuclear war to maybe see some connections to a masculine culture. Dr. Helen Caldicott, a famous Australian disarmament campaigner, wrote a whole book about this called Missile Envy, and pointed to language like the transporter erector launcher as maybe a sign that there was a little bit of masculine energy happening in this space. Against this backdrop, as you have this widespread opposition, the United States and the Soviet Union do start those arms control talks. In the fall of 1981, talks opened in Geneva on what were then called intermediate range nuclear forces. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A if you're at all interested in the arcane reasons why it changes from TNF to INF. It's an interesting story about German power and influence. But the talks themselves were bound up in efforts to win hearts and minds in Western Europe. And the fact that arms control negotiations are happening in parallel with this full court press in the public by both the United States and the Soviet Union meant that these talks were often dismissed as little more than a public relations stunt, not genuine negotiations. Despite immense pressure, like this incredible gathering in October 1983 in Bonn, the deployments did begin in the fall of 1983. Votes in the British, Italian, and West German parliaments were successful to accept their slate of the missiles. When the British voted first, the Soviets stayed at the negotiating table. When the Italians voted to approve their share, the Soviet Union stayed at the negotiating table. When the West Germans voted in the Bundestag, the Soviet Union responded by walking out of the talks. It's a good reminder of just how much the issue was, in fact, about West Germany's place in the European order during the Cold War. I want to talk very quickly about then a rapid transformation that takes place. In 4 years, from the fall of 1983 to the fall of 1987, the story changes dramatically. From the Soviet Union walking out of those arms control talks in Geneva to Reagan and Gorbachev signing the INF Treaty. Well, the story I tell in the book is largely a transatlantic one. I cannot overstate the degree to which that transformation was a product of Gorbachev, of his thinking and his diplomacy. It was Gorbachev who was willing to untie the Soviet arms control package, to sign an agreement on INF, separate from one that dealt with the Strategic Defense Initiative, or the militarization of space, as the Soviet Union always called it, and strategic arsenals. Gorbachev was also willing to accept a fundamentally lopsided deal, which preserved clear US advantages. In the agreement Reagan and Gorbachev signed in December 1987, the Soviet Union destroyed 1,000 more missiles, and the Soviets agreed to a much more aggressive inspection regime than ever before during the Cold War. The treaty was also structured in a way that it preserved US technological advances. The United States and the Soviet Union dismantled and destroyed every ground-based missile from 500 to 5,500 kilometers. But they left air and sea-launched missiles, where the United States had a clear and decisive advantage, untouched. Anybody who knows a little bit about how the United States fought wars in the 1990s might think about why those advantages mattered for US power. We might think that this story ends here with the signing of the INF Treaty. But the aftermath of the treaty caused a whole new round of angst within NATO. So the alliance stared down and confronted familiar difficulties about how credible extended deterrence would be with the removal of the ground-launched cruise missiles and Pershing IIs. They have a new round of disagreement and argument over weapons left outside of the INF Treaty. This group of weapons, called short-range nuclear forces, or SNF, with a range under 500 kilometers, which were due for modernization, and the alliance had already agreed earlier in the decade they would upgrade. These weapons with this short range caused particular problems in the Federal Republic of Germany. Just want you to think about the way the Cold War worked. You have two Germanys. Where is a battle going to happen? Probably in the Fulda Gap, right? Right along the division of those two Germanys. If you are going to upgrade short-range weapons with 500-kilometer or less range, where are they going? West Germany. And probably nowhere else. Does that really make sense? So for a country that had cared a lot about not being singularized, and that horribly clunky term I told you about earlier, this was immensely worrying. These weapons drew attention to nearly all of the uncomfortable realities of the West German position as a state in a divided nation straddling the front lines of the Cold War. Short-range nuclear forces were unpopular with the broad public, unpopular with opposition parties, divided Helmut Kohl's Christian Democrats, and threatened to split the CDU's coalition with Hans-Dietrich Genscher's liberals. Perhaps the whole episode was best summed up by an incredibly morbid slogan popularly used: the shorter the range, the deader the German. I always like the nervous laughter that happens after that. There's always some people who are like, I don't know if that's funny or not. That's really upsetting. Margaret Thatcher chafed at West German opposition to following through on this earlier modernization, convinced that the West Germans now had an outsized role in NATO's decision-making, something that she no doubt felt even more upset about given a commensurate decline in British influence in the alliance's policies. She feared that a swell of popular opposition coupled with deft diplomacy on the part of Mikhail Gorbachev would leave the Allies exposed, facing pressure to accept another zero-option solution, getting rid of an entire class of nuclear weapons, this time short-range nuclear forces. In Thatcher's worst nightmares, this would lead to the denuclearization of Europe, the unraveling of NATO's deterrent, and with it, the foundations of peace in post-war Europe. Even in the spring of 1989, there was widespread concern about the durability of NATO's policies. the earlier deliberations and public opposition to the Euromissiles had fractured the security consensus in key countries, not least the Federal Republic of Germany. And many in and out of government wondered if the alliance could still maintain a posture based on threatening nuclear war in order to make sure one never happened. It was a question that in the end ended up swept away with the Berlin Wall and with communist regimes across Eastern Europe. But that sense of fragility, whether this over the still fresh debates about SNF modernization or the scars from earlier difficulties in the 1980s, remained. And against that backdrop, I think it's not difficult to see why Allied officials were so eager to see NATO play a vital role in the emerging post-Cold War order, whether that was as an anchor for German power in order to secure an acceptable German unification, or whether it was the origins of debates about NATO expansion. By way of conclusion, because I've talked long enough, I want to flag a few of the central takeaways in the book. The first thing is that I highlight a fundamental duality in NATO's strategy of flexible response. There's ample evidence, if you take the time to read it, to support an argument made popular by Francis Gavin that flexible response was a myth. But I also tell a parallel story to Frank's about how much it mattered politically to keep that fiction alive. Even if flexible response didn't work, it was the best thing they had, and it shaped policy in critical ways to make it even remotely plausible. Second, the outcome that happened here, the neat story of the rise and fall of an arms race that is so easy to piece together in retrospect, was always a close-run thing. Historians like to do this. We like to come and tell you, we're really bad party guests for this reason, right? We like to come and tell you everything is more complicated than you think it is. And it's contingent and complicated and complex. I'm here to do all of the same things. But in the case of the Euromissiles, it is very tempting now in retrospect. We know how the Cold War turned out. We know that Reagan and Gorbachev managed to sign this incredible and improbable deal in December of 1987, and that Mikhail Gorbachev himself referred to that as the first step out of the Cold War. We know that communist rule eroded, and then the Soviet Union went the same way. None of the people I write about in the book knew that. They all worried that what if the breakthroughs of the late 1980s were as fleeting as the ones in the early 1970s? What if détente was temporary? What if it was a way to shore up and regroup to fight and compete over the long term, right? A short-term pause, a strategic retreat to fight more effectively over the long haul. The last thing I would like to end with is to say that I think we don't know as much about NATO as we think we do. Plenty of people have written a lot about the alliance. But the thing I came away with in writing this book was that, especially at an American institution, it is all too tempting to think that NATO is an extension of US foreign policy. You turn on the news, you see reporting about the war in Ukraine, and you almost always read the phrase, NATO, a US-led alliance. And I'm not here to tell you like some crazy revisionist story about how the United States was not the leader of NATO. That would be nuts. But what I do want to suggest is that the way the alliance operated during the Cold War was much more of an equal partnership between the United States and the Federal Republic of Germany than we often appreciate. It suited both of those parties and everyone else in the alliance to pretend otherwise. It was easier to not talk about German power and German influence because of the legacies of the Second World War. And so everybody lived with another ambiguity, a convenient fiction, in which West German preferences, West German priorities, and West German anxieties played a critical role in shaping policy in Washington and in Paris, and after 1967, when the headquarters moved of NATO to Brussels, in Brussels. But it was easier for people to say, oh, the United States, it's the United States who is the power primarily in charge. And I think if we rethink much of the Cold War through that perspective, some of our contemporary debates about what role Germany, and now unified Germany, should be playing in European security, some of the profound disappointment we have about German reactions to the war in Ukraine and the renewed Russian offensive, it can give us a new lens to at least rethink some of those questions. Maybe not shed new solutions on them, but at least to think about why those narratives are so pervasive.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.